Did you ever hear the tragedy of Star Wars Rebels? I thought not. It's not a story that Disney would tell you. It's a Star Wars legend. Star Wars Rebels was an animated show with such promise and such hype that it was highly anticipated. It had such promise that it was even deemed a successor to the Clone Wars. Having Dave Filoni as head writer clearly is a pathway to many abilities some would consider to be unnatural. It had so much promise that the only thing Disney could do was ruin it, which eventually, of course, they did. Unfortunately, they boxed the show's writers in with so many restrictions that the tone of the show was lost completely. Ironic. The Clone Wars could be a success, but Rebels could not. For those who don't already know, Raid Shadow Legends is a brand new collection RPG game that's taking the mobile gaming landscape by storm. And needless to say, more than 10 million players worldwide have already downloaded the game in less than 6 months. And the best part, it's free to play. Check out the amazing graphics and details on those champions, and in Raid, you have the ability to personally customize and choose the artifacts and design a unique mastery build for each one of them. The great thing about this game is that everyone can find something that suits their own personality. Some love collecting characters, some are all about the deep storyline and graphics. Personally, I think the game's amazing, but you don't just have to take my word for it. With more than 300,000 reviews, Raid has an almost perfect score on the Play Store. The game is growing super fast and updating all the time, and the highly anticipated new Faction Wars feature is now live. And there's a new awesome rewards program for new players. Get a new daily login reward for the first 90 days in the game. So make sure you go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver plus 50 gems plus 1 energy refill and plus a free champion, Executioner. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. Good luck, and I'll see you there. We all know that Star Wars Rebels was vastly inferior to Star Wars The Clone Wars, as does anyone with a good notion of what either show is. On the surface level, this seems strange. The writing teams for both shows were led by Dave Filoni and overlapped quite a bit. If you ask anyone why this is, most people would answer with the simple Disney, but there's more to it than that. It's not like Bob Iger waves a magic wand that decreases the quality of the writers that come under Disney's employ when they acquire intellectual property, but it's also not a simple matter of nostalgia, as some defenders of Rebels would claim. In this video, we'll be looking at what Disney did and didn't do that made the Rebels fall flat where the Clone Wars succeeded tremendously. When it comes down to it, the difference is one of creative freedom. The Clone Wars wasn't necessarily better because it was darker, deeper, or more violent or anything like that, though all of these things were certainly part of what made it good. It was better because all of those things were on the table, because the writers of the show were given all the tools they could possibly want to tell the story they wanted to tell. Disney doesn't do this. That's why a lot of their stuff feels very clean, very cut and paste, because it is. For writers who want to tell a story that doesn't fit into a neat corporate-ready box, working for Disney is like getting sentenced to the 9th circle of hell. Both the Clone Wars and Rebels were conceptualized as shows for primarily kids. The Clone Wars, as we know, went beyond this pretty quickly, with more mature themes like civilian casualties, colonialism, sacrifice, human shields, and indiscriminate bombing appearing even in the first season. Rebels never really went into mature themes, and the lighthearted nature of the show turned a ton of people off. It was almost entirely surface level, with the little depth that it had being tied into the Clone Wars anyway. This, of course, was Disney's fault. Disney treated Rebels like they treat all of their shows. They put it in a box and didn't let it expand outside of it. A story doesn't need to be dark to be good, but for the Clone Wars it certainly helped. War is dark, there's no way around that. And while there are ways to portray war well without getting too dark, it usually has more impact if you simply embrace the darkness. Approaching themes like war head-on gives them the power they should have, because dark storytelling plays on one's instincts to make the story more impactful. When it comes down to it, the real world is dark. If human history was a story, it'd be darker than any story I can think of. As a result, dark stories feel more real, and when a story feels more real, it's more powerful. This, for the record, is a large part of why The Empire Strikes Back, or for the correct people out there, Revenge of the Sith, are widely considered to be the best Star Wars movies. Those two are by far the darkest in the saga. The Clone Wars wasn't pure darkness, but it had some really dark moments. For an example, we need look no further than the friendly fire scene from the Umbara arc. We recently ranked that scene as number 1 on a list of the show's most brilliant scenes, and in that video, we touched upon how the upfront dark nature of the scene was what lent it its power. It was in your face with the brutal nature of friendly fire, sugarcoating nothing and not shielding the viewer whatsoever. By doing so, the writers made the audience feel the pain and the visceral emotions that come with instances of friendly fire, which is what makes that scene so impactful. Rebels was a different matter. Because Disney stuck it in the box of a kids show, it wasn't really allowed to get dark at all. The writers tried, but there was precious little they could do, and they eventually stopped trying altogether. The darkest Rebels got was Malachor, and if you've played Knights of the Old Republic 2, you know full well that the version of Malachor that Rebels gave was a far cry from how dark the original was. Malachor itself is a perfect example of how a bit of dark storytelling goes a long way. In both Rebels and KOTOR 2, Malachor was the site of an ancient battle that ended with the activation of a superweapon that devastated the world and slaughtered combatants on both sides, resulting in a dead graveyard of a planet that became widely known as Taboo. Both stories visit Malachor long after this atrocity took place, but both stories treated the world very differently. In Rebels, Malachor was a graveyard with a spooky temple, and that was about it. In KOTOR 2, however, Malachor was in itself a wound in the Force, an unnatural blight on the galaxy that threatened to deafen all life to the Force, a world that corrupted those that walked upon it by drowning them in the raw horror of the atrocity that the planet represented. The difference between the two versions of Malachor is pure presentation. The added darkness of the version from KOTOR 2, however, adds so much power to the world. The Rebels version of Malachor is mildly spooky, while the KOTOR 2 version is truly horrifying, and the only difference is a little bit of darkness. A similar factor was how well each show fit in with its established era. The Clone Wars was a pretty good fit for the Clone Wars era. It was dark, it was complicated, and it properly conveyed the nature of war. It was decidedly different among stories from that era, as most Legends Clone Wars material is actually darker than the show ever was, but it still fit in the era pretty nicely. Rebels, however, was a completely different story. Rebels was set during the dark times, and that name alone should tell you what the general tone of the era was. Rebels didn't fit it at all. As we said earlier, the show wasn't dark at all, and as a result, it clashed sharply with the general theme of the dark times. And this isn't just Disney shying away from depicting the dark times properly. They nailed the feel of the era in Rogue One. It's purely a case of Disney not allowing the writers of a show to expand their parameters. Something Disney's Star Wars cops a lot of flack for is politics, but ironically enough, the Clone Wars was much more political than Rebels was. Star Wars, of course, has always been political. The original trilogy was an allegory for the Vietnam War, and George Lucas has repeatedly stated that the Empire represented Cold War-era American imperialism. The difference between Star Wars politics under Lucas and Star Wars politics under Disney is twofold. First and foremost, they were the core of Lucas's story, and as a result, they were well integrated and didn't feel out of place, because they weren't. Contrast this to Canto Bight. Secondly, they were also genuine takes that weren't just shoehorned in for an appearance of awareness. Again, see Canto Bight for contrast. There were political themes in the Clone Wars. The Season 1 episode Trespass was about European colonialism. Several of the Senate episodes addressed issues like military spending and government accountability, and there was even an arc that dealt with corruption and black market shipping. Though, to be fair, that arc kinda sucked. The politics of these episodes weren't shoved in your face, and most people are perfectly capable of enjoying them even if they disagree with the views presented, which is the basic litmus test for inserting politics into a story. But they were still there, which added deeper meaning and gravity to the show. Rebels had exactly none of this. Other Disney material that does have political themes inserted them in an incredibly ham-fisted manner, to the point where, even if you agree with them, they feel really jarring and half-hearted. This problem is entirely because of Disney. Their Star Wars doesn't have the same core political themes at its heart. Disney isn't making Star Wars to tell a story. They're making Star Wars to fill the void where their soul would go with piles of cash. The result is that it takes more for their Star Wars stories not to feel shallow, and while good writers can do this pretty well, Disney didn't let the writers of Rebels do this at all, which is part of why the show feels so incredibly surface level. Most importantly, the writers of the Clone Wars were allowed to take risks, while the writers of Rebels were not. Filoni and his team took a whole lot of crazy risks with the Clone Wars, including, but not limited to, using Jar Jar as a main character in some arcs, including brainworms as a plot device, having Obi-Wan Kenobi fake his own death and come back as a bounty hunter, and bringing back a major character from the movies who had been considered dead for well over a decade. Some of them paid off, and some of them didn't, but what matters is that they were allowed to take them. All of the greatest parts of the show, the Savage Maul plot thread, the clone-centric stories, those unique and intriguing side tales, all of them were huge risks that George Lucas allowed the writers to take. Rebels took a few risks, like including Ahsoka as a major character and rewriting the Mandalorians, but none anywhere near the level they took with the Clone Wars. This wasn't because the writers got lazy, it was because Disney wouldn't let them. Disney, as we said earlier, puts its shows into boxes, and any major storytelling risks inevitably expand outside of those boxes. As a result, only minimal storytelling risks were allowed, and predictably, Rebels was a lot less powerful and interesting. As the saying goes, if nothing is ventured, nothing is gained. So that's why Star Wars The Clone Wars was so much better than Star Wars Rebels, and as per usual guys, I want to know your thoughts. Do you guys prefer The Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebels? And I'm aware that probably 99% of you are going to say The Clone Wars, but to that 1%, I want to know why you like Rebels better, so make sure you let me know. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all those juicy links in the description below to interact with the wider Geetsly's community on our gaming network and on all of our Discords. And if you're a fan of history, I do also have my second history channel where we discuss all the niche and unknown topics of World War II. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.